I find that there is something very strange that's going on in our society. When we talk about being too sensitive, it invariably always has a negative connotation. It gives the impression that the person is somewhat fragile. It even has a misogynist like side, meaning that we kind of assume that women should have this kind of sensitivity and that it's not very appropriate for a man to feel or display this kind of emotionality or sensitivity. And I find that is really a very average way of thinking and certainly very inaccurate because we fail to recognize that someone who is very emotional or hypersensitive is someone who has the gift to be able to live a life much more vividly. This is someone who feels more deeply, who imagines more vividly, who experiences emotions with a higher level of nuance than someone who is not as sensitive. These people experience reality in a much higher definition than the average person. In other words, this is someone who lives at a higher level of perception. So, someone who is very emotional is really someone who is naturally more alive than the average person. I find it strange that people fail to recognize this advantage that sensitive people have. Or maybe society actually denies to recognize this advantage because it points out directly to its own dull interpretation of reality. I think that hypersensitivity and hyperemotionality is really a gift, but it's really a gift that we pay a big price for. I think being hyper emotional makes it such that we feel things too acutely, too vividly at times. And even though it makes the person access those higher levels of happiness and satisfaction, it also brings the person to deeper levels of sadness and grief. And for those people, the grief of humanity becomes their own grief. Not only they explore their own grief deeply, but they also have the ability to sense the grief of others very quickly and to make it theirs. I think of hypersensitive person as someone who is like an emotional sponge in a way. But this emotional sponge has this finite, limited capacity to absorb emotions before it's saturated. And because a hypersensitive person processes reality more quickly, they get overwhelmed very quickly. And I was asked this question once: can we become desensitized? Can we become somewhat thicker skinned? And I really don't think so. I think that hypersensitivity is an immutable, unchangeable trait that we have, and that trying to fight it feels almost like trying not to be oneself. Furthermore, I think that trying to avoid hypersensitivity brings a state of intolerable suffering because it prevents us from accessing those very fine feelings that only a very small fraction of humanity has access to. The only thing that I think would bring that desensitization would be depression, which is definitely not a very positive outcome to look for. So, what is a solution to solve this dilemma? How can we still feel a sense of vividness in our reality without being overwhelmed? I think one major key is to lower the amount of obligations and expectations. As we learn to say no to solicitations, the level of engagement goes down, the level of stimulation goes down, and so hypersensitivity is always this trade off between quality and quantity of experience. Naturally, the hypersensitive person favors quality over quantity, so they get into trouble if they want to have both quality and quantity at the same time. And I think instead it would be a very advantageous way to have a lower amount of stimulation related to the amount of obligation and more stimulation related to the private life. It's always very important that we learn to recognize when we have gotten very close to our emotional threshold. Some of the cues that we got to the emotional threshold could be, for example, starting to feel a sense of overwhelm, starting to feel a sense of distortion of reality, or the feelings of being, for example, stuck in the head in the rumination of past experiences. That's why we need to recognize those limits and allow time to decompress. Some of the most classic ways to decompress for hypersensitive people is to be alone in a safe space. I think spending time alone with a minimal amount of sensory stimulation has the ability to reset the dials to neutral. So the person really feels refreshed and ready for a new set of experiences that way. The other point that is very important to understand and also internalize really emotionally is to recognize that we are only responsible for our own emotions and that of our beloved ones, and not everyone's emotions. I think hypersensitive people tend to care about too much emotion related to others. We rarely feel good when we are not feeling. We rarely feel good when others do not feel good. We would rather feel bad and have our beloved ones feel good than the opposite. So you see, learning not to feel the sadness and the grief and the helplessness when it comes to things we don't have control over is a very good way of going about this, and acting when we have the possibility to do that, and having somewhat of a peace of mind when we don't have the possibility to change things. Also, learning to set the right boundaries and keeping enough healthy distance from others is somewhat of a good challenge, I think, for hyper-emotional individuals, because they tend to be hyper-caring, and that blurs the lines between the needs of ourselves and the needs of others. In other words, hyper-emotional people have to learn to be selfish in a way. Selfishness for them is a very foreign notion, and it almost goes against who they are. Hyper-emotional people generally have this give-all tendency, where when they adopt a person in their loving circle, they feel a deep need to nurture them, to do everything for them to feel happy. Of course, this is a wonderful gift to have, but sometimes adopting the wrong person by mistake or by association could lead to unforgivable and forgettable feelings of betrayal and disgust. And it most times makes the person really feel hurt for a very long time, even well past the experience. So it feels almost like the central protective healthy selfishness is absent in hypersensitive people. And because their sense of self-satisfaction usually comes from satisfying others, it makes it for a dependent way to be happy. So this hyper-caring attitude that they have becomes almost a hindrance to their self-actualization. Mostly people around them who are being cared for might inevitably fail to return the highest level of care, or even acknowledge it for that matter, simply because they're not as sensitive, so they're not even able to recognize that they are doing something wrong to begin with. And that leads to a spiral of disappointment and grief. Let alone the fact that hypersensitive people tend to have longer cycles of grief and recovery. So it really takes a long period of time to get over disappointment and grief when we're hypersensitive. But I think that learning to distinguish between emotions that belong to us and emotions that belong to others is a very simple way of being able to overcome this mixing of emotions that come from others and from ourselves. So then we become more comfortable putting limits to where they belong and minding only our emotional business. And make sure those boundaries are in place to allow us enough space to feel sane and not to feel that we're being overwhelmed. I think that these tools could be very helpful, but it takes quite some time to internalize them on an emotional level. And so that's one of the reasons why really repetition is helpful, and also meditation is very helpful, because it empties the mind and allows the mind to clear up some of the redundant information that keeps being stuck and uses the energy of the brain in not so helpful of ways. But it's very interesting. I'm talking right now, and the whole talks feels to me veering a little bit more towards the sadder side, and it's probably because my own nature. But I think hypersensitivity is an incredible gift to have, but it is a gift that deserves to be used very wisely. We cannot use hypersensitivity lightly, because it can have a very bitter side that we will have to that we will access if we're not careful about how much time we spend with our commitments, and if our boundaries are not respected and clear in our minds. I'll see you soon.